will we get started? Okay, nice. Hopefully you guys can hear and see me okay. Hearing is the main part. But welcome everyone. Really glad to see so many faces. My name is Maya and I am the Community Engagement Officer for the Centre for Environmental Justice under Community Law Mediation. And the Centre of Environmental Justice, our aim and mission is to engage, inform and mobilise individuals, community groups and organisations on environmental injustice. And we're really delighted to be collaborating with Friends of the Earth to bring you this event today. So currently many communities are facing a huge challenge with cold and damp homes and having to choose between heating or eating. Now the Irish government is revising its Energy Poverty Action Plan, and it's crucial that this plan reflects the needs of our community in Ireland. As part of the government's Energy Poverty Action Plan consultation process, the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications wants to hear about your lived experience of struggling with energy costs in order to inform their policy decisions. So this is the aim of the webinar. We're hoping to support people, individuals, organizations, groups, members of the community to input into this consultation and ensure that your voices are amplified. So during this, the webinar is an hour. We'll be sharing information on the current policy landscape, providing some practical kind of guidance on how to craft a submission. And we're here if you have any questions or queries as well. So at the end, we have some space for questions. And so we have some people from different kind of organizations and experiences who will kind of give you a bit of an insight into the policy landscape of energy poverty in Ireland. And so our first speaker is Clodagh Daly, who is manager for the Centre of Environmental Justice. And she's going to set kind of the context and provide an insight into a rights-based approach. So I will hand over to you, Clodagh, if you are good to go.
Thanks, Maya. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us over your lunch break. So I'm just going to share my slides. And what I want to do today is just provide a little bit of context in terms of what the government is doing on energy poverty, and I suppose what we think the government should be doing on energy poverty, and would really welcome any thoughts or questions or suggestions that you have afterwards. So what this is about is developing a kind of long-term vision and legislation to address energy poverty. So our organisation provides free legal advice clinics on both environmental and housing issues, and our clinics regularly see people who are dealing with energy poverty and who are struggling to pay their bills. We know from a 2019 report by National Traveller MABS that 77% of travellers live in energy poverty and spent at that time an average of 26% of their income on energy. That was in 2019, before the energy crisis that started about 2 years ago. So we can only imagine that that may have worsened since. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission also published a report a few years ago where they identified migrants, one-parent families, which are predominantly headed by women, youth, older people, and those with disabilities as least likely to keep the home warm. And these cohorts are represented disproportionately in the private rental sector. We know that access to adequate levels of energy is a precondition for the realization of many of our rights. It impacts our health, it impacts our living standards. It's really essential to social inclusion, and it's really increasingly connected to employment opportunities, with many workplaces adopting kind of a hybrid or even completely remote approach. So having adequate access to energy is really essential. And it's really important from our perspective that it's addressed through a rights-based approach. So kind of taking that human rights-based approach makes sure that the lines of accountability are clear between government to its citizens. And it ensures that the responsibility of government at all levels to its people are very clear, and especially those who are vulnerable to energy poverty. Because energy poverty is a really multidimensional issue, it also requires a kind of whole of government response. So, you know, in terms of how the government might deal with an issue like energy poverty, it falls within the remit of a number of departments. So environment, health, housing, and social protection all deal with energy poverty. And so we need all of these departments to kind of work together to address this issue in full. And so what we've had in place so far is that, well, there was a strategy to tackle energy poverty initially developed in 2011. Following that, there was a strategy developed that ran from 2016 to 2019. And so in 2019, the strategy to combat energy poverty ended, it lapsed. That strategy was quite unambitious. It didn't really have good governance or kind of accountability provisions. So, the responsible Minister of State only had to report to Cabinet and to the Minister for Communications at that time. The strategy also aimed to establish an independent energy poverty advisory group, and that would have been really helpful as a kind of an independent watchdog type of body. And that never happened either. And so a replacement strategy was never developed. And then 3 years later, when we were already in the energy crisis and an energy poverty crisis, the department published an energy poverty action plan. So this plan isn't based on any legislation. So that means that it's not a statutory plan. In other words, it's not legally binding. So the minister responsible for the plan, the Minister for the Environment, doesn't have to report on progress under this plan. There are no official binding targets within the plan. There are no monitoring or accountability mechanisms. So the plan was developed and it was designed to last no more than a year. And most of the measures within the plan were kind of one-off and short-term measures, kind of demonstrating a sort of crisis-oriented response from the government. And this kind of approach has been really criticised by the European Commission. So last October, the European Commission provided recommendations to all EU member states, and they called upon member states to kind of move past these really short-term measures and looking at income supports as a sole measure of energy poverty support. So what they really wanted to see was longer term measures that would actually address the cause of the problem, namely the provision of efficient and affordable energy and homes that are not that are actually insulated. And Claire is going to speak to that more. And so if we don't have kind of a legislative framework in place, our efforts to address energy poverty do risk remaining aspirational. So with the current Energy Poverty Action Plan coming forward, we really think that it needs to have clear objectives and targets so that we know what it is we're working towards. Because at the moment, there's no objective to actually move towards eliminating energy poverty. We need to have accountability so that we know who is responsible for what, when different items are meant to be delivered on. We need proper resource allocation. We need coordination and a whole of government approach between all of those different departments. We need monitoring and enforcement so that we know whether we're making progress and whether additional actions are needed. And then we also need this to ensure long-term political commitment towards the eradication of energy poverty, regardless of government of the day. We need to know that energy poverty is an issue that's going to be addressed. So our primary recommendations are, first of all, to place the Energy Poverty Action Plan on statutory footing. That just means that the plan will become law rather than policy that's aspirational and that's not binding at all. It should be legal. It should be a legal plan and placed on statutory footing. So this would clarify the responsibilities of government at all levels. It would ensure accountability and effective coordination and collaboration, not only between the departments, but between external bodies and public agencies as well. And this would ensure that efforts to address energy poverty are not just aspirational, but they are enforceable. So this should provide objectives, targets, and strategies for implementation. The other reason why this is really, really important is that it's essential for consistency with EU law. So Ireland is required to produce a national energy and climate plan, and that includes measures to address energy poverty as well. And what it specifically requires is specific measurable reduction target for energy poverty, and this is under an EU directive. And the Commission reviewed Ireland's National Energy and Climate Plan and doesn't think that it complies with that EU directive in terms of how we're addressing energy poverty. So we do actually need to see those targets in place to make sure that we are compliant with EU law. We would also like to see the government consult with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So under the Human Rights and Equality Act, under Section 10, the government can commission the Human Rights and Equality Commission to examine any piece of legislation or policy and essentially human rights and equality proof it. So look at it to see what kind of impact will it have on human rights, what kind of impact will it have on equality, and they can make recommendations to government on that basis. So, including that measure would essentially ensure that that the action plan would be equality and human rights proofed. And then the final recommendation that we have is that we would like to see government start now to draft energy poverty legislation, and in consultation with people in this room and also with key stakeholders like the Economic and Social Research Institute that do a lot of research and data collection on energy poverty, and with civil society as well as those most impacted as well. So we know from the previous Energy Poverty Action Plan that the ESRI have been commissioned with carrying out research on energy poverty, and it's our understanding that the government intends to develop legislation when that research is finished. But the research is going to run until around 2026. We think that a lot can actually be done in the meantime to make sure that we're progressing this. So the Scottish Fuel Poverty Act, this was developed in 2019 at the same time that Ireland's fuel poverty strategy lapsed. Provides a really good example that Ireland can kind of build on. So they have legislation in place that provides a really clear definition for fuel poverty and how it should be measured, legally binding targets to reduce and ultimately eliminate fuel poverty, a duty on ministers to produce strategies outlining how they will achieve their targets, a duty on ministers to produce a monitoring report every 5 years, and the establishment of that independent watchdog body, a fuel poverty advisory panel. We definitely think improvements could be made to this legislation. We would like to see, further consultation with those who are experiencing energy poverty, and especially with households who have additional energy needs. And we'd also really like to see access to justice provisions included in any legislation to make sure that people can turn to the courts if the targets in the legislation aren't being met. So that's it for me. I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'm really happy to take any questions.
Questions now or at the end?
We can do questions at the end. Yeah.
No worries. Okay, thank you so much, Clodagh. And next we have Claire O'Connor, who is the Energy Policy Officer with Friends of the Earth. And she's going to give a bit of an insight into guaranteeing a fair energy transition, fair retrofit program, and equitable fossil fuel phase out. So, Claire, it's your turn.
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to give. I'm Claire O'Connor. I'm Friends of the Earth Energy Policy Officer. I work mainly on energy efficiency and retrofitting and decarbonisation of our heating sector as well, and looking at the social justice elements of that transition. So I'll give you a quick run through of why Friends of the Earth are working on this issue and what we would like to see to address energy poverty and climate in tandem as well. So we run a campaign called Warm Homes for All that tackles energy poverty and energy pollution and the root causes of both of those. I really like the tagline, heat our homes, not the planet. So it's all about making sure that everyone has access to warm homes and clean, affordable heating. And that's really what we're trying to achieve with this line of work that we do. The context with regards to emissions and energy poverty is that Irish buildings contribute to about 37% of our annual carbon emissions. Irish homes currently use 7% more energy than the average EU home, but we emit 60% more carbon emissions. We also have the lowest levels of renewable heat out of any other member state in the EU, and most Irish homes have a BER of C or a lower. And then the context that we're operating in is that we've over the last few years, we've seen record levels of energy poverty. And in 2022, a third of Irish households were estimated to be living in energy poverty. So it's a problem, but I think, like Clodagh said, it's not a one-off problem, and it's something that will need to be addressed long term and with structural changes, not just with these one-off energy credits that we've seen over the last few years. So yeah, that's where Ireland is with regards to our renewable heating at the moment. Just 6% is renewable, 6% is renewable. The rest is really fossil fuels at the moment, mainly oil and gas. And we're petty last in the EU at the moment, unfortunately. And then I'll talk a little bit about the retrofitting policy, because retrofitting is one key policy measure that can really help people improve the efficiency of their homes and to reduce energy poverty, to help reduce energy poverty. It's one piece of the jigsaw. So we're seeing a commitment from the government to retrofit 500,000 homes to a BER, a building energy rating of a B2 by 2030, and to install 400,000 heat pumps as well, so by 2030. We're seeing retrofitting grants and schemes and loans being announced, which are really positive steps in the right direction, but there's still lots of different people who aren't able to access those and can't get involved then in the energy transition. So particularly tenants, low income earners, older people is one cohort as well, the traveller community, and people living in much older properties who can't access these at the moment. Yeah, the root causes of fuel poverty, one is low incomes, one is high energy costs, and one is inefficient homes as well. And the main one that we'll be looking at today through Friends of the Earth lens is the inefficient homes, because ultimately we want to reduce the amount of energy people need, and insulation is a key way of doing that. So the impacts of energy poverty are quite significant. It's poor health outcomes for children and older people in particular. If people can't afford their energy bills month to month, the chances of them actually investing in things like solar or heat pump are much smaller, so they're not able to access these clean energy alternatives. They can't afford other necessities, and they lose kind of financial security, and it can have a big impact on people's mental health as well. And why is this important for Friends of the Earth? So it's people who are already struggling or in difficult situations. They're often the people who are living in the worst housing conditions, and they're often people who are then locked into fossil fuel infrastructure, which means they're locked into volatile energy prices. And as I said, they can't access renewable energy and really get involved in the energy transition, which can lead to further marginalisation. We've done some work with some of the organisations here. St. Vincent de Paul are here, Community Law and Mediation are here as well. I think National Traveller and MABS are here, and a few others who we've come together to jointly work on how we can address energy poverty in a way that also tackles climate change and brings down our emissions as well. I'll tell you our priorities for this new energy poverty action plan. So firstly, we'll be looking at ramping up social housing retrofitting. The second, we'll be tackling cold homes for tenants in the private rental sector. Third, we'll be providing energy advice and retrofitting support for everyone. And the fourth is to prevent fossil fuel lock-in for people on the lowest income. So the first one is looking at social housing, and you don't have to take notes, I suppose, if you want to put this into your submission, because I'll put a link into this afterwards. We'll share all of these slides with you after. Social housing tenants are the cohort who are most at risk of energy poverty based on their home ownership tenure, basically. And at the moment, the government has set a target of retrofitting just a quarter of those homes by 2030. And we don't think that's enough, because it's a way that we can bring down emissions, improve the quality of social housing, and really kind of really positive impacts on energy poverty levels. Sorry. So we want to see increased ambition through this new energy poverty action plan by setting a new target to retrofit all social housing by 2030, and to retrofit the least efficient social housing units first. Every local authority has been given a target number of homes they have to retrofit, and a lot of them seem to be picking the low-hanging fruit and the houses that don't actually need that much work. So we need to focus on worst performing homes first. We need to see increased funding for local authorities to actually carry this out. A lot of them are finding the funding they're getting from the Department of Housing is actually not sufficient to retrofit as many houses as they'd like to. And also to support renewable technologies as part of this retrofit process. We're seeing some really interesting initiatives like Energy Cloud, which provide free energy basically for some approved housing body tenants when there's too much renewable energy, basically. So when there's too much wind energy, there's excess energy, and they actually provide that free of charge to people in AHCs, basically, which is a really cool initiative. I think something that could be rolled out across the country. And then tackling cold homes for people in the private rental sector who don't currently have any agency to carry out retrofitting themselves, and they can be afraid that they would risk eviction or their rental prices going up as well. And so what we want to see is a plan for introducing minimum BERs in the private rental sector. Government have said they'll do this in the past number of years, and they've said they'll start it in 2025, but they haven't told landlords yet, and they haven't kind of been explicit on those tenant protections yet either. We also want to see an expansion of the Warmer Home Scheme, which is a free retrofit scheme for people on certain social welfare payments, to include tenants who are receiving HAP as well, to make sure they're not excluded from it. And again, we also need to see the explicit protections for tenants as well. And then another thing we want to address is the access to information about retrofitting and renewable energy and the energy transition. And this is a huge barrier for a lot of people in actually participating in retrofitting, and there's a lot of confusion and misinformation, I think, about it at the moment. So we want to see a community energy advice service in every local authority to help people even applying for the grants, and to work directly with NGOs to target people who can avail of the free retrofit scheme, who most need it. And then we need to build capacity of groups like sports clubs or community groups, to allow them to co-develop tailored solutions for retrofitting and renewable energy that meet the needs of their community. I'm going to fly through this because I know Izzy has to go soon. And then also preventing fossil fuel lock-in for low-income households. So we're still seeing the government install oil and gas boilers into the homes of people on the lowest incomes through the free Warmer Home Scheme at the moment. Most people, when they get a boiler, they keep it for 10 to 15 years plus. So effectively, that will lock these people into using fossil fuels for the next 15 years approximately. And I think to address this, we want to see all homes that are retrofitted under any government scheme to make sure they're all ready to get a heat pump installed, or that they're ready to connect to a district heating network, which is another renewable heat solution. And as well as that, we need to fully subsidise the costs of BER assessments and the technical assessments required for the installation of heat pumps, just to remove any of the cost barriers that are currently preventing people from accessing renewable heat. Thank you. And I think Izzy is going to come on now. I know her time is limited, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was great. And yeah, next we have Izzy, who is the Research and Policy Officer with St. Vincent de Paul, and she's going to give us a bit of insight into what SVP's priorities are and what people are experiencing on the ground.
Thanks, Maya. Hi, everyone. Really good to be here today. I'm going to, as Maya just said, try and give a sense of SVP's perspective from assisting people in energy poverty, and I suppose how that translates into the kind of priorities and just a couple of the key recommendations we're going to be submitting to the consultation. So I'm going to just start off setting out kind of our point of view, or maybe some of the key things and that perspective of how we're supporting people currently, and kind of bringing that perspective to the consultation, and then just 2 or 3 of the key recommendations, some of which cross over with what Claire and Claudia have talked about as well. So our main point is that it's really clear to us at SVP that people are still really struggling with the cost of energy. People are still facing that kind of urgent and serious energy poverty. And we need to move, kind of, as has already been touched on, from the short-term measures that we've kind of seen announced and put in place over the last couple of years, while inflation was still kind of climbing so rapidly, towards those longer term measures that mean people can adjust to higher prices that we have today. And we don't kind of find that there's a higher level of energy deprivation that kind of now becomes a kind of a normal level of deprivation. Now we need to kind of bring that right down, and, you know, all of the conversations about we need to set a target to actually end energy poverty. So at SVP in the last 2 years, so looking over 2 years, we've seen the number of people requesting assistance with energy go up by almost 70%, which kind of shows really clearly how many more people are reaching a stage where they just can't keep up with their energy costs. And that might be people in a situation, and members would see people finding that, you know, these high bills that people couldn't have conceived of a few years ago just kind of just keep coming and kind of, you know, month to month, quarter to quarter. Or people, and we would often support people on prepay meters, and people are kind of really cutting back on their energy usage because they simply don't have the money to kind of top up. And so they're kind of using at home a lot less energy than they need to kind of stay warm, stay healthy at home. So that kind of the reality of what SVP members are seeing is also shown really clearly in the official statistics, in the silk deprivation statistics, and the most recent ones came out just a couple of months ago. And these deprivation statistics show how many people are kind of cutting back on essential energy usage. And again, it shows that increase over the last couple of years, particularly amongst groups where we see really high rates of either not being able to keep their home warm or having had to turn off the heating in the last year. And so some of those groups that just have very high rates would correspond really clearly to what to some of the groups that SVP membership would support as well, are one-parent families, people who are unemployed, people out of work due to kind of ill health or disability, and also people, and more increasingly, people who are renting. So to touch on just a couple of our key recommendations, and I could talk about a lot, but I'll just kind of try and go through a couple. The first one is the need to make sure social welfare payments that have been boosted over the last couple of years by lump sum payments, that is now made into permanent increases in social welfare that people can rely on and, you know, plan for the future, plan for the winter ahead when we're talking about energy poverty. So particularly today we were talking about the fuel allowance there. So whilst inflation has slowed down, prices are still very high, and people need that stability to know that they're going to be able to meet this year's bills and pay from their energy, enough energy that they need from now on. So we want to see an increase in the fuel allowance, and we also want to see more people receive the fuel allowance. And our particular kind of priority recommendation there is that the fuel allowance is extended to people on the working family payment. So we know that around or more than 100,000 children are in these families. And so extending the fuel allowance to people who receive, households who receive working family payment, would support a lot more people out of energy poverty. And then a second key recommendation that Claire has just touched on is the need for a new service of community energy advisors. And, you know, we've seen the need for this and been calling for this introduction for a while, but we think it's just getting clearer year on year that people need someone to turn to when they're really struggling with their energy costs and keeping up with their energy needs. So that might be in a situation where someone's had a bill come in that they can't pay. They've got a particular situation, you know, with their energy supplier and being able to keep up with their costs there. It might be not being sure how to navigate finding the best tariff for them. You know, tariffs are, you know, looking to become more complex. So navigating that kind of those options and finding what's best for them. It might be on the retrofitting energy efficiency side, like how to make the best of you know, what's possible at home, but also access things that might be a longer term solution. Like if there's retrofitting grants that are there for them, they might not know about them, they might need support through the application, and there might be things that can be done in the meantime too, in terms of kind of quick installations and kind of quick win measures. So really it's just about having a local port of call for people that, you know, they might be struggling with different aspects of energy, and they can call and be guided through, okay, what's available to you? What can we do now? What can we do in the long term? And we think that's really important to have that kind of available locally to people. And I think that services responds really to, you know, people's situations that they're experiencing currently, you know, people who might be going without the energy they need, people who are struggling to keep up with costs. And it's also part of the energy transition and making sure that whilst we're reducing energy poverty, we're also making sure everyone can take part in the benefits of things like renewable energy. So it's about everyone kind of moving forward together. And finally, I'll just touch on energy efficiency in the private rented sector as well. SVP members would often see people in kind of poor quality private accommodation, and they're limited obviously to what they can do to improve their housing. And obviously there's also the relationship there with their landlord, and people obviously often don't want to jeopardise their relationship and their tenancy. So an important step we want to see from government is to widen the criteria for the free energy upgrades to include private tenants who receive housing assistance payments on condition of having kind of security in a long-term lease, as Claire said. And also there's other things we can do to help people kind of whatever housing sector they're in, such as making things like solar panels more widely available, for example, installing solar panels in social housing, including them as part of the free retrofitting grants, so people also have kind of their own energy coming in at home. And I also think that's kind of important to make sure there isn't kind of inequality widening in who accesses these things, you know, in renewable technologies. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope some of that was useful. Unfortunately, I can't stay for the conversation, which I'm sure is going to be really interesting. I already learned a lot from Claire and Clodagh, but please feel free if there's any kind of particular questions for me. I'm sure they can be sent on to me. Yeah, thanks very much.